The sirens came
What were you
first,
thinking? You
sharp
can't
and
just wander
sudden,
off like that.
slicing through the quiet lake air like something out of a nightmare.
This is unacceptable.
One moment,
I
our
demand
afternoon
an
was calm and
explanation
ordinary.
right now.
The next, flashing red and blue lights bounced off the water, and every head on the shoreline turned toward my son. A woman stood there pointing, furious, confident, absolutely certain she had just won. She was already telling her story before the police even stepped out of the cruiser. Loud. Detailed. Dramatic. She accused my son of trespassing, breaking rules, threatening safety, ruining the peace. Her voice carried across the lake as if volume itself were proof. Neighbors drifted closer. Phones came out. Everyone loves a scandal, especially when someone looks guilty. My son stood still, knee-deep in water, hands relaxed at his sides. He didn't argue. He didn't interrupt. He didn't look nervous. To anyone watching, that calm might have looked suspicious. To me, it was familiar. I had seen that calm before, in moments where authority didn't need to announce itself. The officers approached him carefully, hands near their belts, eyes scanning the scene. The woman kept talking, pointing harder now, listing imaginary laws she was sure he'd broken. She glanced back at the crowd, soaking in the attention, feeding off it. She believed this moment belonged to her. When the officers asked my son what he was doing, he answered plainly. Routine work. Wildlife monitoring. Standard procedure. Nothing flashy. Nothing defensive. The woman laughed, sharp and dismissive, shaking her head as if the truth were a joke she'd already debunked. The lake itself seemed indifferent. Water rippled softly. Birds skimmed the surface. The world stayed calm while tension built on shore. One officer asked for identification. My son nodded and reached into his wallet without hesitation. That was the moment everything slowed. The woman leaned forward, arms crossed, lips pressed into a smug smile. She expected handcuffs. Apologies. Validation. She had no doubt the next few minutes would end with her being right. What she didn't know was that she hadn't just called the cops on a random man at the lake. She had called them on the very authority responsible for protecting it. And once that truth surfaced, there would be no undoing what she had set in motion. The air felt heavy, like it does right before thunder breaks. Everyone was watching. Everyone was waiting. And the truth was about to land harder than any siren ever could. One of the officers took my son's identification and stepped a few paces away, flipping it open with practiced ease. At first, his expression stayed neutral, professional. Then something changed. His eyes lingered a second too long. He looked down again, then up at my son, then back at the card. Subtle, but unmistakable. The woman didn't notice. She was still talking, still building her case, still convinced she was in control. She paced along the shoreline, gesturing wildly, explaining how the lake was basically private and how people like him needed to be kept in check. Each sentence grew louder, sharper, more desperate to dominate the moment. The second officer asked my son a few follow-up questions. Where had he started his work that day? How long had he been there? My son answered calmly, clearly, without embellishment. He didn't mention titles or rank. He didn't need to. Facts were enough. Behind them, the first officer spoke quietly into his radio. Not rushed. Not alarmed. Just confirming something. The sound of that radio seemed to slice straight through the woman's monologue. She paused for half a second, frowned, then kept going, as if refusing to let doubt creep in. Neighbors had fully gathered now. Some leaned against boats. Others stood with arms folded, eyes darting between the officers and my son. Phones stayed raised. The lake had become a stage, and everyone sensed the turning point approaching. The officer returned, handing the ID back to my son with a nod. His posture shifted slightly, respectful now. He addressed my son by his first name. That single detail landed like a stone dropped into still water. The woman stiffened. "Why are you calling him that?" she snapped. "You don't know him." Her voice cracked at the edges, irritation replacing confidence. She looked from one officer to the other, searching for the agreement she expected. Instead, one officer asked her to take a step back. Just one step. Calmly. Firmly. She scoffed, laughed nervously, and took the step, but the power dynamic had already shifted. She crossed her arms tighter, jaw clenched, eyes darting. For the first time since the cruiser arrived, she wasn't speaking non-stop. The officer asked my son if he was currently on duty. My son nodded and gestured toward the equipment nearby, explaining the survey, the permits, the ongoing monitoring. His tone never changed. The woman opened her mouth to interrupt, then stopped herself. Something was wrong. She could feel it now. The story she'd built was cracking, and she didn't yet know why. The lake stayed quiet. The air felt heavier. And everyone watching understood that the next revelation would change everything. The officer reached toward the truck and lifted my son's uniform jacket, the one he hadn't bothered wearing yet because the day had started peacefully. The fabric unfolded slowly, deliberately, as if time itself wanted to stretch the moment. The shoulder patch caught the sunlight first. The emblem was unmistakable. State insignia. Wildlife Division. Rank markings stitched clean and official. The officer didn't raise his voice. He didn't announce anything dramatically. He simply looked at my son and spoke one word that shattered the woman's certainty. "Chief." The shoreline went silent. Even the woman seemed unsure she'd heard correctly. Her face twisted in confusion, then irritation. "Chief what?" she snapped, forcing a laugh that sounded thin and brittle. "That's not funny." She glanced at the officers, expecting them to smile, to reassure her, to explain the joke. No one smiled. One officer calmly explained what that word meant. That my son wasn't trespassing. That he wasn't breaking rules. That he wasn't subject to her authority, imagined or otherwise. He was the chief wildlife warden for the region. The person responsible for enforcing the very laws she claimed to be defending. The color drained from her face, then rushed back all at once. Her mouth opened, then closed. She tried again, words tumbling out of order. "But I called you," she said, as if the call itself should override reality. "You have to do something." The officer nodded. "We did," he replied evenly. "We responded." Around us, neighbors shifted. Some lowered their phones slightly. Others leaned in closer. A few exchanged looks that said everything out loud without words. The story had flipped, and everyone knew it. The woman's posture changed. Shoulders tight. Chin lowered. Confidence collapsing inward. She tried to pivot, suddenly polite, suddenly concerned about safety instead of rules. She blamed confusion. Stress. Misunderstanding. Anything but herself. My son listened without interrupting. He didn't correct her. He didn't explain further. He didn't need to. The truth had already done the work for him. One officer returned her identification and explained, carefully and professionally, that making false or exaggerated reports could have consequences. Not as a threat. As information. The same kind she'd refused to hear earlier. She nodded too quickly, eyes darting toward the crowd, toward the water, anywhere but the people in front of her. The attention she'd wanted so badly now burned. The lake breeze moved across the surface, rippling the water gently, indifferent to embarrassment or authority. Birds schemed low, undisturbed. Nature continued, unimpressed by human ego. The woman muttered something that sounded like agreement and stepped back. The moment was over. But the impact was just beginning to settle. Because once authority reveals itself, there's no pretending it never happened. The tension didn't disappear all at once. It drained slowly, like water receding after a sudden surge. The woman stood there for a moment longer than necessary, as if waiting for someone to reverse what had just happened. No one did. The officer's attention had shifted fully to managing the aftermath, not indulging her wounded pride. One officer asked if she had anything else to add. The question was neutral, professional, but it carried finality. This was her chance to escalate or retreat. Her lips pressed together, then parted. She glanced at my son, really looking at him now, not as a problem to remove but as an authority she couldn't overpower. "No," she said finally. "I guess not." The words sounded foreign in her mouth. The officer nodded, thanked her for her cooperation, and gently reminded her to be mindful when using emergency services. The tone wasn't harsh. It didn't need to be. Reality had already done more damage than a warning ever could. She turned away stiffly and walked toward her house, shoulders tight, head lowered. The crowd began to thin as the excitement faded. Phones slipped back into pockets. Conversations resumed in hushed tones. The spectacle was over, but the memory would linger. The officers shook my son's hand, thanking him for his work and apologizing for the interruption. He returned the gesture with the same calm respect he'd shown from the beginning. No ego. No satisfaction. Just professionalism. They climbed back into the cruiser, and this time, there were no sirens when they left. As the vehicle disappeared down the road, the lake seemed to exhale. The breeze felt lighter. The water returned to its gentle rhythm. But something fundamental had changed. My son slipped his uniform jacket on and returned to his work, checking equipment, making notes, continuing exactly where he'd left off. That steadiness impressed more people than any confrontation could have. Authority that doesn't linger on victory leaves a deeper mark. Across the water, the woman's porch lights stayed off that evening. Curtains closed. Silence replaced the voice that once carried so easily across the shoreline. For someone used to controlling narratives, losing it publicly was a heavy blow. Later, neighbors approached my son with quiet nods and brief words of respect. No one made a scene. No one apologized on her behalf. They didn't need to. The truth had already reorganized the social balance of the lake. That night, as the sun dipped behind the trees and shadows stretched across the water, I realized the incident wasn't about humiliation. It was about exposure. Assumptions exposed. Entitlement exposed. And above all, the difference between imagined authority and earned responsibility laid bare for everyone to see. But the story didn't end with embarrassment. What followed would reshape how this lake community operated for a long time to come. The next morning, the lake woke up buzzing in a way it never had before. It wasn't loud or obvious, but it was everywhere. Conversations started earlier. People lingered longer near the docks. Small groups formed, broke apart, then formed again, all circling the same unspoken subject. What happened yesterday had already become part of the lake's identity. My son returned to finish his survey, parking in the same spot, walking the same path, treating the day like any other. But the reactions weren't the same. People nodded as he passed. Some asked polite questions about fishing zones or wildlife boundaries. Others simply watched with a new awareness, measuring their assumptions against what they'd witnessed. By mid-morning, a notice appeared on the community board near the dock. Laminated. Official. Clear. It outlined wildlife regulations, protected areas, and enforcement authority. No names. No drama. Just facts. Whether intentional or perfectly timed, it landed with weight. Residents stopped to read it. Some frowned. Some nodded. A few whispered. More than a few glanced toward the woman's house across the water, then quickly looked away. No one said anything openly. They didn't have to. The woman didn't appear outside that day. Her dock sat empty. Her curtains stayed drawn. For someone who once thrived on visibility, absence spoke volumes. People noticed. Silence filled the space where certainty used to live. That afternoon, my son received a call from a nearby district asking for coordination on upcoming surveys. Professional. Routine. Yet it reminded me how much larger his role really was. This lake wasn't a stage for ego. It was part of a system that existed whether people respected it or not. Later, a neighbor approached me quietly and said, "I didn't realize who he was." The statement wasn't defensive. It was reflective. That distinction mattered. As evening settled in, the woman finally stepped outside. Her movements were careful. Controlled. She avoided the dock and stayed near her porch, eyes down, posture guarded. When someone passed, she nodded but didn't speak. The voice that once carried across the water had gone silent. My son stood at the shoreline again, clipboard in hand, focused and calm. Watching him, I understood something deeply. Real authority doesn't announce itself with noise or demands. It reveals itself through consistency, through calm, through doing the work even when no one is watching. One phone call had changed how this community saw power. And once that perspective shifts, it never fully returns to what it was before. But the most important moment hadn't happened yet. That was still coming. 2 days later, the lake hosted its monthly HOA meeting, usually a dull routine of maintenance updates and budget complaints. This time, attendance nearly doubled. Folding chairs filled the community hall, and people arrived early, whispering in clusters, eyes flicking toward the entrance as if expecting something dramatic to happen. The woman arrived last. She chose a seat near the back, far from the front row she once claimed without hesitation. Her posture was rigid, hands clasped tightly in her lap, expression carefully neutral. When my son entered, wearing plain clothes, conversation dipped noticeably. Heads turned. A few people straightened. The dynamic in the room had permanently shifted. The HOA president began the meeting with practiced calm, but even his voice carried an edge of awareness. After routine announcements, he cleared his throat and addressed recent events. No names. No accusations. Just acknowledgement. He reminded everyone that wildlife regulations were state law, not neighborhood preference, and that enforcement authority did not require community approval. Every word landed with precision. My son wasn't asked to speak, but when questions arose, eyes drifted toward him instinctively. When someone asked about fishing limits, he answered briefly and professionally. When another asked about shoreline modifications, he clarified the law without judgment. Each response reinforced the same message: this was never about personal power. It was about responsibility. Then the woman raised her hand. The room stilled. She stood slowly, clearing her throat. For a moment, it looked like she might retreat back into her seat. Instead, she spoke. Her voice was quieter than anyone remembered. She said she'd misunderstood the situation. That she'd acted out of concern for rules, not malice. She didn't apologize directly, but she didn't accuse either. It wasn't redemption. But it was restraint. The HOA president nodded and thanked her for speaking. The meeting moved on. No confrontation. No applause. No public reckoning. And somehow, that felt more final than any argument could have been. Afterward, people filtered out in small groups. A few stopped to thank my son. Others simply nodded. The woman left quickly, avoiding eye contact, disappearing into the evening without comment. Outside, the lake reflected the fading light, calm and unchanged. Watching it, I realized something important. Power struggles burn hot and fast. Authority grounded in purpose endures quietly. What happened here would be retold, exaggerated, softened, reshaped. But the truth would remain. One call. One assumption. One revelation that changed how everyone understood control. And still, the story wasn't finished yet. A week passed, and life around the lake settled into a new rhythm, one shaped by awareness instead of assumption. Boats moved slower near the protected coves. Fishing lines were cast more carefully. Even casual conversations carried a different tone, as if everyone now understood there were real boundaries beneath the surface, quietly enforced whether anyone liked it or not. My son continued his work without drawing attention to himself. He arrived early, left late, logged data, checked markers, and documented wildlife patterns with the same calm precision as always. Yet everywhere he went, there was a subtle shift. People asked before acting. They listened when he spoke. Authority, once invisible, had become understood. One afternoon, a family approached him near the dock, confused about where their kids could swim. He explained patiently, pointing out nesting areas and safe zones. The parents thanked him sincerely. Their children listened too. That moment mattered more than any confrontation. Education always outlasts embarrassment. Across the water, the woman's house remained quieter than before. She still lived there. Still waved occasionally. But she no longer positioned herself as the lake's enforcer. The invisible crown she once wore had slipped away, and she hadn't tried to retrieve it. Sometimes, losing control teaches lessons that winning never could. Then something unexpected happened. A storm rolled in one evening, sudden and sharp, churning the lake into dark, restless waves. A small boat drifted too close to a restricted area, its engine stalled. Panic echoed across the water as the wind picked up. Without hesitation, my son moved. He coordinated with local responders, guided the boat away from danger, and ensured everyone reached shore safely. No cameras. No audience. Just action. The same officers who'd responded to the earlier call worked alongside him seamlessly, trust evident in every exchange. The woman watched from her porch. Later, as the storm cleared and calm returned, she approached him quietly. No crowd. No drama. Just two people standing near the water. She thanked him. The words were simple, unpolished, but genuine. He nodded and wished her a good evening. That was it. No apology demanded. No forgiveness requested. Just understanding finally arriving where ego once lived. As she walked away, I realized the story had come full circle. The lake didn't need a self-appointed guardian. It needed someone who respected it enough to protect it without applause. In the end, the loudest authority faded. The quiet one remained. And the community learned the difference the hard way. But one final moment would seal this lesson permanently. The final shift came quietly, the way real change usually does. There was no announcement, no meeting, no confrontation to mark it. Instead, it showed up in habits. People posted fewer homemade signs along the shoreline. Complaints that once traveled loudly across docks were now handled through proper channels. The lake felt less tense, less performative, more like a shared responsibility than a contested territory. One afternoon, a state vehicle arrived with updated boundary markers and educational plaques. My son supervised the placement, working with a small crew to ensure everything was accurate and accessible. The signs weren't warnings. They were explanations. They didn't threaten consequences, they clarified purpose. Protect the nesting areas. Respect seasonal limits. Preserve what makes the lake thrive. Residents gathered at a distance, watching quietly. No one objected. No one argued. Understanding had replaced entitlement. The woman stood among them. She didn't push forward or hang back dramatically. She simply observed, arms folded loosely, expression thoughtful. When one of the plagues was finished, she stepped closer and read it carefully. Not to challenge it. To learn. That distinction mattered. Later, she approached me instead of my son. Her voice was calm, almost hesitant. She admitted she'd lived by the lake for years but never truly understood it. She said she thought protecting something meant controlling it. She paused, then added that she realized now how wrong that was. I listened. I didn't correct her. Growth doesn't need commentary. As the sun lowered, the crew finished their work and packed up. The lake reflected the new signs softly, blending them into the landscape instead of fighting against them. It felt balanced. Intentional. Right. That evening, laughter carried across the water again. Not sharp or performative, but relaxed. Kids played near approved swimming areas. Boats moved respectfully. The lake had reclaimed its peace. My son sat at the edge of the dock, feet resting near the water, watching the surface ripple gently. He looked content, not triumphant. Protecting something means allowing it to exist without ego. He'd always understood that. The woman walked past, nodded once, and kept going. No tension. No resentment. Just coexistence. Standing there, I realized the call she'd made didn't just expose her mistake. It exposed the difference between authority taken and authority earned. One demands attention. The other never asks for it. And when the story is retold, as it always will be, the lesson will remain the same. You don't need to shout to be powerful. You just need to be right, consistent, and grounded in purpose. Only one chapter remains, and it brings everything together. By the time summer settled fully over the lake, the incident had transformed from gossip into quiet folklore. New residents heard it secondhand, softened by time but sharpened by meaning. A story about assumptions. About a phone call that backfired. About the day imagined authority met the real thing and didn't recognize it until it was too late. My son never corrected the retellings. He didn't need to. His presence alone anchored the truth. He continued his work steadily, showing up before sunrise, leaving after dusk, logging reports, checking habitats, protecting spaces most people barely noticed unless they were told not to touch them. That was the work. Always had been. The woman returned to her routines, though they were different now. She attended HOA meetings quietly. She asked questions instead of issuing rules. Sometimes she volunteered for cleanups, keeping to the background, doing the work without commentary. No one crowned her for it. No one mocked her either. The lake had moved on, and so had she. One evening, as the water glowed orange under the setting sun, a visitor asked me if it bothered us that she'd called the cops in the first place. I thought about it before answering. The truth surprised even me. No. Because without that call, the balance wouldn't have shifted. Without that moment of misplaced certainty, the community wouldn't have learned the difference between control and care. Sometimes disruption reveals what piece was missing. The lake thrived that season. Wildlife returned to protected coves. Nesting areas remained undisturbed. Complaints dropped. Respect increased. All without shouting, threats, or dominance. Just clarity. My son packed up his gear on the final day of the survey and stood for a moment, looking out over the water. He didn't smile dramatically. He didn't look proud. He looked satisfied in the quiet way that comes from doing something correctly, even when it's misunderstood at first. As we walked away, I glanced back once more. The lake was calm. Balanced. Unclaimed by ego. That's when it struck me most clearly. Authority doesn't arrive with sirens or demands. It arrives with responsibility. And when it's real, it doesn't need to announce itself. It simply is. The woman had called the cops expecting reinforcement. What she got instead was perspective. And that, more than any consequence, changed everything. The story ends there, not with embarrassment or victory, but with understanding. A community reset. A lesson learned. A lake protected. And if you ever think power comes from being the loudest voice in the room, remember this story. Sometimes, the quietest person standing by the water is the one everyone should have listened to all along.